You may be. My name is Andrew Hyde, and I'm a senior fellow and director at the Transforming Conflict and Governance program at the Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and I will moderate today's discussion. Today's event is part of a series under the Stimson Project, U.S. Financial Leadership and Multilateral Diplomacy. This project examines the impact of uneven U.S. payment patterns to the UN, both their amounts and timing, and how that affects U.S. global leadership aspirations, as well as the influence Washington seeks to have on the work priorities and direction of key UN bodies. Today's discussion will explore how sustained and dependable U.S. financial investment across the UN, both for assessed and voluntary funding, can advance U.S. national interests and what that means to the UN. I'm pleased to have three guests with me today who bring depth and variety of experience on this issue. First, we have His Excellency Christopher Lu, who is the U.S. Ambassador for UN Management and Reform at the U.S. Mission to the UN in New York. Ambassador Lu was sworn into that role on January 4th, 2022. During the Obama administration, he was the White House Cabinet Secretary and then Deputy Secretary of Labor. A lawyer by profession, Ambassador Lu worked in private practice and spent 8 years as Deputy Chief Counsel of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Next, Representative Sarah Jacobs, who was just reelected last week to her second term in Congress, representing California's 53rd District in San Diego. Prior to her 2020 election to Congress, Representative Jacobs worked at the State Department, in fact, where our paths briefly crossed, and at the UN in UNICEF and at the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. In her first term, Representative Jacobs served on both the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Armed Services Committees. She has led efforts in the House to repeal the arbitrary self-imposed U.S. 25% cap on assessed contributions to UN peacekeeping. And then our discussant today for this session will be Jordi Hannum, Executive Director of the Washington, D.C.-based Better World Campaign. The Better World Campaign is the advocacy arm of the United Nations Foundation, and they have worked for decades highlighting the importance of strong U.S. engagement and funding of the UN. Jordi has held a variety of positions at the Better World Campaign, building on his 4 years of work in the U.S. House of Representatives as a legislative assistant. I will ask our two panelists this morning to provide several minutes of initial observations, and then ask Jordi to provide some context for our discussion today. Jordi and I will follow with several questions to dig a bit deeper and prime the discussion further. Then we will turn to the audience for further questions, which I encourage you to place in the Q&A window on your screen. Jordi and I will then pose a selection of those for the panelists to address. First, Ambassador Lu.
Thank you, Andrew. It's an honor to be here with Congresswoman Jacobs and Jordi to discuss this important issue. I want to thank the folks at Stimson for holding this conversation. This is something that we talk about all the time, not just here in New York, but in Washington, but I'm not sure people on the outside fully understand the magnitude of the problem. So we're looking forward to discussing why paying our financial obligations on time and in full makes such a difference. But I will simply say this, a hallmark, I would say, and one of, I think, the great accomplishments of the Biden administration has been its prioritization of multilateralism. And I think you've seen in a most pronounced way why multilateralism matters in not only the run up to the war in Ukraine, but obviously what's been taking place over the last 9 months and the way that the UN has been one of our focal points of rallying the world against the Russian aggression. And that's not to mention all of the other actions we have taken around the world to deal with issues like food insecurity, like poverty. Obviously, we're still dealing with a global pandemic. All of that requires a robust attention to multilateral organizations. And the best way, I think, really to show our support to those organizations is to pay our financial obligations. So I look forward to diving into these issues more deeply about why it matters.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Lu. Congresswoman Jacobs, thank you for joining. I turn this floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. It's so great to be on this panel with Jordi and Ambassador Lu. Look, as someone who used to work at the UN, both in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations and at UNICEF and in UNDP, I can tell you firsthand how important US commitments to the UN is and how they impact our national interests. So, I know we talk a lot about how supporting the UN is good for the UN, but the fact of the matter is supporting the UN is also good for the United States, because everything we're aiming to do on the world stage, whether it's addressing climate change, food insecurity, or competing with China and Russia, it isn't possible without our partners, allies, and the power of UN institutions. And fulfilling our commitments ensures the strongest possible position for the US to advocate for our national interests. On peacekeeping in particular, we cannot hope to expect success without consistent and reliable funding to the missions we support. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Failing to meet the obligations hurts the effectiveness of these missions and the ability of the troop contributing countries to pay their troops' salaries. These are often low-income countries that have historically voted with the United States at the UN, and now we're starting to see them change some of their votes. And we've seen actors like China and Russia use US funding shortfalls to make inroads with developing countries and push back against US priorities. So I've introduced a bill that would repeal the 25% cap on US peacekeeping contributions. The House passed it earlier this year. And we're going to keep working to make sure that we're investing in the UN and investing in UN peacekeeping, because, for all the reasons I just said, and also research shows that they're highly effective. And it's actually 8 times cheaper to fund a UN mission than to deploy our own armed forces. And as a member of the Armed Services Committee, I think a lot about that. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks so much. Let me turn it over to Jordy now.
Well, thank you. And I just want to say how pleased I am that the Stimson Center and Andrew put together this event, and that Congressman Jacobs and Ambassador Liu could join us. And they played a key role in getting kind of the U.S. back on the global stage. And part of that is restoring contributions. And I also just have to say, we've just come from a contentious election that is still not over with. And during the run up to election day, much of the focus and discussion was on domestic issues. In fact, I saw a breakdown showing that of the 3 million total ad spots on the airwaves this cycle, only 7% of them touched on an international affairs issue, particularly remarkable, thinking everything that's going on. And that's actually a jump from prior years. So part of the point of this discussion was to get us talking about foreign policy again, given the major global challenges we face. I will also say, though, that in terms of the election, in reviewing what candidates from both sides of the aisle said on the trail, they called for, quote, putting diplomacy first. Some of them highlighted the importance of resources for diplomacy and development to promote American stability. And this tracks with our own UN Foundation polling going back 20 years, showing that Americans on both sides of the aisle believe the U.S. should be paying its dues on time and in full. And our most recent poll, which showed that 70% agree that the UN is an organization still needed today. And that's a perfect segue in what we want to discuss today. The U.S. is both the largest debtor to the UN and largest funder. So I look forward to examining how U.S. contributions advance U.S. and global interests, how setbacks, how shortfalls set us back, and how we can ensure the UN remains relevant going forward, given current global threat. So I thought I'd get started with a couple questions and then turn it back over to Andrew. But Congressman Jacobs, I wanted to start with you and start with the debtor part of the equation. Of course, we mentioned your leadership on this, but as it stands, the U.S. is currently $1 billion in arrears and on peacekeeping. And you sponsored a bill to fix that, which will allow us to pay at the full assessed rate, and as such, fully reimburse troop contributing countries instead of paying at the arbitrary cap of 25%. The House endorsed this fix, the first time it had ever gotten the kind of the full House support, but we weren't kind of able to get it over the finish line. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of lifting the cap, paying in full, and whether you plan to introduce similar legislation next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I was super proud that we were able to get that bill past the House. Unfortunately, our colleagues in the Senate weren't able to finish the job, but I'm definitely planning on reintroducing next year. We're still working to see if there are other legislative vehicles that we can try and get this in. And look, it's really important. The fact of the matter is, we do end up paying more than 25%, but we end up having to do this yearly waiver that creates a headache and also means we're not paying on time, and creates a headache for us, creates a headache for the UN. So it's not strategic and it doesn't make any sense. And I think it's really important that we are lifting the cap to ensure that the UN peacekeeping missions that we vote to authorize are as effective as possible. And it's not possible when there are these funding shortfalls and this timing issue. We all know that there's a high correlation between troops that don't get paid and troops that don't necessarily do what you want them to do. So paying the troops is very important. But it's also important for US standing and credibility on the world stage. Our friends need to know that the US keeps our promises, including our funding obligations, and that we are still willing to lead and that we want to make sure that these institutions are successful. And we've seen how important leveraging those relationships and credibility is in Ukraine, for instance. So a big part of our ability to be successful in Ukraine is the fact that we were able to muster coalitions. And if we want to keep being able to muster coalitions, if we want to keep having a seat at the table in the areas we have a strong national security interest, whether that's human rights or democracy, and we know we need to pay our dues. And we've already seen China use the cap and our arrears against us in attacking our interests, like human rights, and in courting development countries who are the same troop contributing countries that bear the burden of our non-payments. So there's, the US is a strong leader at the UN. There's no reason that we should let this one issue get in the way of all of the other good work we're doing and fighting the same fight year after year on an annual waiver where we end up actually paying, but then we rack up millions of more dollars in dues, but we don't get the credit for doing it with our partners and allies at the UN, and it can be used against us. It just doesn't make any sense.
And thank you. And I want to kind of build on that point to you, Ambassador Liu, in terms of mobilizing others and also what other countries are saying when we're not paying in full. I mean, you're of course in New York each day and working with other ambassadors and permanent representatives. And the US not only has significant arrears, but we also pay our regular budget dues late. I mean, 10 to 18 months late, unlike almost any other nation. We're one of the few that do it. And our regular budgets dues are not only kind of to keep the lights on at the UN, but they also pay for political missions in places like Lebanon and Sudan and Afghanistan and Iraq. So what are other countries saying, to you about late payments?
Thank you, Jordy. I just want to start by really just thanking Sarah Jacobs. I mean, her leadership on this issue is just remarkable. And I could almost just stop my presentation now, just capture the 2 minutes she just spoke, because I think she said in that 2 minutes exactly what needs to be said in every single forum. I do think we should start by saying, look, the US is the biggest funder, and we can talk a little bit more about that. I mean, we pay about $11.5 billion to UN organizations. That's twice as much as the second highest contributor, Germany. It's 5 to 6 times more than what China pays when you add the voluntary and the assessed contributions. But it is important. We not only are the biggest funder, we are the biggest debtor. We owe about $1 billion right now, and we continue to rack up additional arrears every single year. Now, the Biden administration has put forward a plan in the last 2 budgets to try to pay down that $1 billion, to try to lift that artificial cap of 25%. Unfortunately, it has not gone through, but hopefully with the continued leadership of Representative Jacobs, we can make progress on that. But it is important to understand what that means. So for the regular budget, we pay 22% of the regular budget. For the peacekeeping budget, we'll say it's about 27%. So imagine you're running any organization. It could be a nonprofit, it could be a federal agency. If 22 or 27% of the money isn't coming in on a timely basis, or if some portion of that is not coming in, that creates liquidity issues. And I think people sort of forget this, and who are in Washington, they sort of assume, well, the federal government, we run on continuing resolutions, or we can borrow additional money. That's not the way the UN runs. If the UN doesn't have the money in hand, it can't perform its operations. And as Congresswoman Jacobs say, let's look at that from the peacekeeping side. Many of the countries that we ask to take on the lion's share of providing troops and police for these incredibly dangerous peacekeeping missions are poor countries. So we're asking the poorest countries to contribute their troops. We're not necessarily paying them in full or on time. And that both creates a disincentive for those countries to provide the troops, and those that are providing the troops aren't being paid on time, which affects the training, affects the equipment, and that hurts the readiness. And when we're talking about places like Mali or Central African Republic or South Sudan, where Congresswoman Jacobs, Jordy, you and I were just there, these are very tough assignments. And you really want to make sure that you have the best trained and equipped peacekeepers there. So that's what happens on the peacekeeping side. On the regular budget side, because we don't pay on time, even if we were to pay on time at the end of a fiscal year, at that point, we're probably already, 9 to 10 months behind. But even then, because of CRs, we're often, 12 to 18 months behind. That forces the UN to constantly shuffle money in and out. And that means the basic operations of the UN, it's everything from the work it does around development work and humanitarian work and counterterrorism and food security and all of the variety of things that the UN does. It's constantly moving money in and out to try to pay its bills, keep its, the lights turned on to help pay employee salaries. It's just not a responsible way to run an organization. And to your point, Jordy, we hear about this every single budget meeting we have with the Chinese. They love to dig at us with this because they understand, notwithstanding how much a contributor we are, that undercuts our credibility at the UN. And it's also worth noting, it's this point about not paying in full on time is not just the point that the Chinese make. It's a point that our allies make as well, because they understand that the US, notwithstanding the great work we do, notwithstanding our rhetoric about multilateralism, we are falling short on our financial obligations. And so, we clearly need to do much, much better on this.
Thank you. Andrew, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, all of you. I just want to say to the audience, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A so we can move to a more of a general discussion. There's a function on your screen there for adding in questions, and Jordy and I will field those questions and pose them to the two panelists. I want to come back with both of you, if I may, and talk a little bit about the kind of funding that the U.S. does. I mean, Ambassador Liu, you mentioned earlier that the U.S. puts in more than twice as much as Germany, and we're the largest single contributor. I think some of that is transactional, but an awful lot of that is what I guess I would call an investment. I'd be interested, sort of from your point of view, what are some of the top benefits, if you will, that the U.S. gets from putting that amount of money into the UN? Where does that help advance U.S. national interests? And Congresswoman Jacobs, in terms of your conversations on Capitol Hill and in a political environment, what are some of the things you cite to make the case to your fellow members of Congress, senators, and others to say why this is worthwhile? Let me ask maybe Ambassador Liu, if you go first.
Yeah, look, there are certainly geopolitical benefits to this, but let's just understand. I mean, we as Americans give this funding to organizations like the World Food Program or the World Health Organization because we think it's the right thing to do. We think it's our obligation as a developed country to help lift up the world, to make it more secure, more stable. I mean, that is really, the principle on which the UN was founded back in 1946, to create a more stable world. So we think all of these, the voluntary contributions that we provide underpin that. But to the point that Congresswoman Jacobs made, it's not just in the UN's interest, it's not just in the global interest, it's in the US interest as well. It's in the US interest when we have stable countries, hopefully stable democracies. It's in the US interest when we don't have food insecurity, when we prevent pandemics from spreading around the world, as we've seen painfully over the last couple of years. This money is a small investment in our overall US security. As we've seen, the amount of time, resources that have been expended just on the COVID-19 pandemic over the last couple of years. If we can get in front of the next pandemic with a relatively small investment, that is a huge payoff down the road. I'd also say on the peacekeeping front, Congressman Jacobs mentioned there was a 2018, 2019 GAO study that Senator Menendez had commissioned that looked at the cost effectiveness of UN peacekeeping operations and basically found that if the US were to do the same to do the same operation on its own, it would cost us 8 times what we give in terms of our share for peacekeeping operations. So it is a significant amount of money that the US gives, but it's a small down payment to create a more safe and secure world.
Congresswoman Jacobs?
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. And those are basically the arguments I use when talking with my colleagues, right? We care about violent extremism. We care about instability. Actually, investing in the UN's ability to respond to these issues saves taxpayer dollars in the long run. And, I think it's no coincidence that the way we were able to get the peacekeeping cap lifted in the House was in the U.S. Competes Act, which was our competing with China bill, right? Like, I think many more of my colleagues are starting to understand that we are in this new time of strategic competition, or whatever kind of competition we're calling it these days. And that a big component of how we're going to be able to keep the rules-based international order that the United States has long led is by making sure that we are continuing to invest in these institutions and these coalitions.
Great, thank you. You mentioned, I think both of you have touched on other countries and their reaction. You mentioned obviously China, our allies. In terms of how much does this issue come up, both on the positive side of what the U.S. invests, and also in terms of the fact that the U.S. is behind on peacekeeping in particular? Is this a pretty constant feature of our interaction with other countries, Ambassador Liu, or is this sort of a sporadic issue that is raised at times with the U.S. and is not as a significant a factor?
I would say it depends, Andrew. It's a constant issue that is raised by China. It's a sporadic issue that's raised by our allies. This issue, I wouldn't say is overly raised by the rest of the UN, but I do think to the broader point, I think we need to tell a better story at the UN in terms of our U.S. contributions. As I said, look, I'm never going to apologize for the fact that we are the largest contributor by far. And I think we need to tell that story to the developing world more about what we give in terms of, that 11.5 billion I talk about does not even count all of the bilateral assistance that we do to individual countries. So, the United States, we are a very, very generous country with this unfortunate blemish that we really need to address.
Yeah. All right, let me turn to some questions that we're getting from the audience. And this first question that I'll raise brings up something that has come to mind as well. I think Ambassador Liu, you touched on the UN's liquidity crisis and the impact that some of the erratic U.S. payment patterns have had on the UN's financial situation. Alex Barrow asks, sort of building on that idea of whether we're seeing a global economic climate and high inflation also starting to affect UN operations and create more financial pressure on the organization. And is that in fact inflaming or magnifying the liquidity crisis the UN faces? And does this add more pressure, I think, on the US to pay its contributions on time and in full?
Yeah, I think it's too soon to say whether global economic pressures are going to affect this liquidity issue. But I do think we can say this, which is every country is scrutinizing more its contributions, both its assessed contributions as well as its voluntary contributions to the United Nations. I spent a lot of time talking to members of Congress. Unfortunately, we have allies like Congresswoman Jacobs who can make the case. But, we have to make that case every appropriations year why this money matters. And it's not, it's competing against a lot of other really important national security priorities. And I think these difficult trade-offs, these difficult conversations are ones that are not only happening in Washington, but in capitals, around the world. I do think that's on the regular budget side and the peacekeeping budget side. I do think on the voluntary contribution side, we are starting to see those pressures. I think, in particular with our allies who have expended a great amount of money to address the war in Ukraine right now. That really has put pressure on a lot of other funding needs in the developing world. And so obviously it's one of the many reasons why this war in Ukraine needs to end. But even when that war ends, there's going to be a significant rebuilding process that's going to be required. So there are greater funding pressures around the world because of Ukraine, because of food security. Obviously, climate change becomes an important issue and one that's being discussed right now in Egypt. So the needs are very great right now, and the resources are being increasingly strained.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan.
Well, I was just going to add one point there. I mean, in October, I was on a trip with the World Food Program to Kenya, and in Kenya, in East Africa, I mean, they're part of the worst drought in 40 years. I mean, it basically hasn't rained in 4 years. And when we were there, it was just kind of weeks or so after WFP had to contemplate drastically cutting its assistance. It had already reduced the size of its rations by 50% because of cuts in funding. They were contemplating more. Fortunately, the U.S. or the leadership of Congressman Jacobs and Ambassador Liu and others actually in September made the largest contribution to the WFP in Kenya. And they were immediately, literally within 24 hours, able to ramp up assistance. But that's going to go away in 6 to 8 months, and that's part of Alex, to your question. I mean, that's the cuts are due to obviously a number of different reasons, but partially due to inflation. It's more expensive for the WFP to purchase items, and I think it's important because WFP is considered one of the kind of gold standard of UN agencies, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and they are facing a funding crunch all over the world, and a voluntary funding model is important. Countries should be able to support what they fund, but the notion that a solely voluntary funding model is the way to go, I mean, the evidence just doesn't back that up. And there was a congressional panel actually that looked at this about a decade ago and said that a solely voluntary funding model would actually underfund U.S. priorities and lead to the U.S. paying more. And so that having a mix of kind of a voluntary and then an assessed model, which is important. Yes, the U.S. pays a lot, but remember that in an assessed model where countries are based, countries pay based on their GDP. Yes, the U.S. pays a quarter, but other countries are paying 75%. It's a model that gets other countries to step up and pay more, and that's in our interest. And certainly, China's, it looks like their contributions are going to eclipse the U.S. in a few years. And with rising contributions, there is more influence. And I think the U.S. benefits from this model. Of course, there's ways to improve it, but having a mix of assessed and voluntary is a good way to has been shown to be effective, particularly for U.S. interests.
Thank you. I actually would like to build on that, Congresswoman Jacobs. Does, in your discussions on Capitol Hill and in the political context, does the burden sharing argument carry some weight with both other members of Congress, maybe even some of your skeptics in both houses? Is that a powerful argument that you can make, and does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think everyone wants to make sure that our partners and allies are doing their part and that no one is relying solely on the United States. And I think we see that in the UN context. We see that in the security context with NATO and what's happening in Ukraine. So I think that, making sure that we talk about this as burden sharing, that, we actually talk about the fact that the way the UN operates is more efficient than us doing it alone is a very compelling argument to many of my colleagues.
Yeah, I think we have a question from Ed Elmendorf that sort of builds on this idea, is actually asking about the UN eventually reducing its dependence on assessed and voluntary contributions from governments. And I think I guess the alternative would be that somehow the UN is funded directly by other kinds of taxes or other kinds of contributions from the private sector or nonprofit sector. Is this something that is a desirable model to move to? Is it feasible? is there sort of a long-term benefit or effect that either of the panelists and Jordy would see on the UN?
Look, I think a lot of the UN agencies, that the ones that have the voluntary models, are already working to find other sources of funding. They do get private sector funding. They do, many of them are piloting different ways to have some resource generation themselves. But the fact of the matter is, I don't really think there is an alternative to governments actually paying into the UN, in part because you want governments to have skin in the game and feel like, they are part of this institution, and part of that is the dues paying component of it. And as much as we've talked about how the US does not always pay on time and in full, the fact of the matter is government funding is much more reliable than any other source of funding you would get. And I don't think we want to leave the UN to the whims of financial crises, et cetera. So I don't see an alternative. I think there are ways to bolster the funding base of the UN, but I don't see them as alternatives to governments actually paying dues.
Yeah, I will 100% agree with that comment. I mean, look, the UN certainly needs to expand their donor base. There is, admittedly some donor fatigue among member states because we get hit up repeatedly for new initiatives, and they're all important. And so certainly there needs to be more effort to look to, the philanthropic community, to the private sector. But there is no other substitute for member state funding. I mean, when you're trying to raise, just the core budget of the UN is around 10 billion. There's just no way you could come up with $10 billion of outside funding in a reliable way to do that. And as Congressman Jacobs says, nor would that be a good thing. You want governments to have a skin in their game in the UN. You don't, the UN is supposed to be a body that speaks on behalf of 193 countries. And the words of the resolutions that are passed in the UN should have some effect on those member states. And that just wouldn't be the case if there were a private sector funding model. I would also say this. I mean, we talk a lot about U.S. influence at the UN. I mean, we, notwithstanding this, unfortunate blemish of us not paying our dues in full and on time, the U.S. has significant leverage, not just in the UN, but through all of these other UN-related agencies, because of the financial contributions that we make. That gets reflected in the priorities of these agencies. It gets reflected in how they're staffed with Americans, the values that they operate in. So that funding does carry leverage, and we shouldn't forget about that.
Thank you. Jordy, would you like to pose another question from the audience?
And I want to say two things. One, Congresswoman Jacobs kind of raised this point about the benefits that come from kind of our engagement and our contributions. And this is certainly something that we're seeing, other countries, namely, kind of China, take advantage. I mean, they're investing more because they see the benefits. I put in the chat a good article from National Defense University on the strategic benefits that come from engagement, that China and Russia are investing more because they see the benefits. And so I want to kind of ask kind of a two-part question, starting with Congresswoman Jacobs on it. I mean, again, you've worked at the UN, at the State Department, you've seen the missions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, on the strategic benefits that come from, kind of our engagement, but also take a step back from not just the financial contributions of it. I mean, other countries are investing more. China has created a standby force of peacekeeping. They're training more peacekeeping officers. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the benefits that come not only from financial contributions, but not only the U.S. investing, but are the ways that we can invest more. Congressman Jacobs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in addition to the funding, there's a lot more we can be doing. I will say we already do quite a lot. We have the Global Peace Operations Initiative, or because we're government, GPOI, and it's been highly successful at enhancing the peacekeeping capabilities of partner countries, which we saw when we were in Sudan and South Sudan. And to be honest, one of my takeaways actually from that trip was that it would be helpful to do more training, that we should be training peacekeepers while they're on the ground in the missions themselves, rather than just in the troop contributing countries before they deploy. That we could, do more training and targeting around things like civilian protection, which we know is a constant issue that we're asking peacekeeping missions to do, and it's really hard to do. And being able to do that training on the ground might help there. So this is something we're actively working on in Congress right now. We also don't really provide peacekeepers. We currently contribute about 34, I think. China has over 2,000, and we certainly don't need to match that one-to-one. And there are many reasons why we don't have more U.S. service members actually in peacekeeping missions. But there is certainly more we can be doing to increase U.S. support in this area, to make sure we are providing the unique skills and capabilities that the U.S. military has to peacekeeping missions at headquarters when it comes to training and logistics and all of these things. I think that that will help not only increase our national security and our influence. It will also make these peacekeeping missions more efficient and effective.
Trudy, can I just jump in? I think that, the Congresswoman said so many great things, but I think one point that I think really needs to be stressed is the concept that the U.S. by and large does not provide peacekeepers. We have a couple dozen who are largely doing, advisory type functions. So we're basically asking lots of other countries to put their men and women's lives on the line to ensure peace in very, very difficult circumstances. So in my mind, the least we could do is actually to pay fully the financial obligations that we are owed for these missions.
I'd like to just jump in and say I totally accept those points. I do think it's important, obviously, to remember that, especially in peacekeeping, the U.S. has a lot of unique and special capabilities, and that a lot of the U.S. efforts are in support of and aligned with UN peacekeeping. And so when we look at the totality, and we've talked about sort of a bigger perspective on this, some of what the U.S. has done over the years to support UN peacekeeping is outside of the specific framework of UN peacekeeping, but it's been a support element or an aligned element that I think is also worthy of keeping an eye on. I'd like to turn to a question now from one of my colleagues at Stimson, Richard Ponzio, who asks that with the upcoming SDG summit planned for September next year and the Summit of the Future planned for September of 2024 at UN headquarters, how can the prospect of these gatherings of world leaders help the U.S. step up and meet its financial commitments to the UN system? And he goes on to ask, what specific reforms are most urgently needed to convince U.S. policymakers that the United Nations will continue to be fit for purpose and good value for money? Ambassador Liu, maybe I'll ask you to start.
Yeah, let me just jump in there. I think we always talk about making the UN fit for purpose, and I think what the Summit of the Future is intended to do is to kind of look at the next several decades of where the UN goes. And I think, look, we have both seen both sides of the coin with the war in Ukraine. We've both seen 140 plus countries squarely line up against Russia's aggression, but notwithstanding all of these resolutions, the war continues. And I think for a lot of people, they wonder, why does the UN even exist? And I think, this opportunity, these next couple of years with these two summits coming down the road are an important way for the UN to reimagine itself, to rebrand itself, to use this as an effort to educate people about why the work of the UN matters. I'm so grateful to Congresswoman Jacobs because she gets it, because she's worked in the system and she spent time. But I'm amazed at how few people, and I will say this, before I took on this job, I didn't really understand what the UN did either. And I think it speaks to more, the UN needing to explain itself and frankly needing to adopt important reforms that enhance transparency and accountability, but it also comes to all of us in the US government to better tell this story to the American people. It's one of the reasons why we have sent my boss, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, on the road to try to explain this more, because frankly, the US Congress is frankly a reflection of the sentiments of the American people. And if the American people don't understand what the UN does, you shouldn't be surprised that there's not great movement in Congress to address these financial issues.
Congresswoman Jacobs, if I could ask, sort of building on that, do you find yourself as being a kind of teacher to your fellow members of Congress about the UN and an explainer, or is it pretty well understood?
As the third youngest member of Congress, I spend a lot of time explaining a lot of things to my colleagues. But no, look, I think a lot of people here don't understand the UN, don't understand how the UN operates or all of the various work that the UN does. And I agree. Like, I think a lot of it is an educational component to make sure, people really understand the value we get from investing. Just to go back to the question of reforms a little bit, like, I think reforms is a big part of being able to make the case to increase funding. And our bill that lifted the cap, that passed the House, included a tie to reforms that we wanted to see. And I think it's important as we look ahead and at this summit of the future and really figuring out how the UN can operate most effectively coming up, we need to make sure that the UN works more closely with the regional actors to create common political strategies among all of them, that we have a system-wide approach and strategy to protecting civilians during a peacekeeping mission, but also after a peacekeeping transition, which has been something that has been a challenge. And that, we continue to implement accountability measures, including, as we have unfortunately seen, sexual assault and abuse by peacekeepers. The UN system was created in a time and place, and we are not in that time and place anymore. And so making sure we are making all of the institutions work better, is really important. And, that includes involving more local actors in decision-making, both at the peacekeeping mission level, but also in how we do development work and how we do other works. Often the UN's work is requested by the government, right? That's how the UN goes into a place. The government requests a peacekeeping mission, they request UNDP assistance, et cetera. But many times these governments aren't necessarily reflective of what the population wants. And so how do we operate in this new environment where there are so many more stakeholders than just governments when we're looking at these problem sets?
Yes, thanks. Excellent point.
Can
Jordan, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up to Congresswoman Jacobs, and just kind of on the outreach side of it. I mean, do you have the sense, of course, in terms of Ukraine, there was criticism of the Security Council, but by and large, I think over the last year, you've seen the UN at its best, and the Secretary General, helped negotiate, the Black Sea grain deal, which has literally helped save the lives of millions due to US engagement at the UN. Russia is far more isolated, because of the relationships built. But, for the first time, you saw member states kick out, a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia, from a UN body, the Human Rights Council. You saw, over 140 countries vote for the full withdrawal of Russian forces. You see the IAEA going in, braving shelling to try to prevent literally a nuclear meltdown. That's in all our interests. Do you have the sense that members are saying, you know what, I don't like the UN and this, but it really serves a valuable role, and that the arguments have a little more sway, or is that not the case? Certainly welcome your thoughts as well, Ambassador Liu.
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot still in flux about what Congress is going to look like next year. I think it's pretty likely, very likely, almost certain now that Republicans will have a majority in the House, a small one. And I think a slim Republican majority, we will see increased skepticism of the UN. I think it's very clear, and I'm sure we will expect to see some legislation to cut funding. Now, I think Ukraine has, in part, shown the importance of the UN, as you just said. It's also put into focus some of the shortcomings with the Security Council and the veto structure. And I was pleased to see the Biden administration's support for reform to expand permanent membership and limit the use of vetoes. I think that will be very important. But look, even with Ukraine, even with the support for Ukraine that's coming from Congress, I wouldn't necessarily say that all of my colleagues are taking the lesson that means more investment in the UN. I'll give you one example, and this is sort of UN adjacent, but we are all concerned about the human rights abuses and gross violations of human rights that Russia is committing in Ukraine. And yet I have a bill that would enable the United States to provide material support to the ICC solely for the purposes of the Ukraine investigation. And we still can't get that passed, even though we all agree that we need a multilateral approach to addressing these human rights issues and making sure that there's accountability. And so I wouldn't, I'm a perpetual optimist. So hopefully my Republican colleagues are seeing the importance of the UN from this, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it makes the case on its own.
Thank you.
I will add, I think we all need to do a better job of making that case as well. I mean, I do think, with a couple of exceptions on the Republican side of the aisle, there really has been bipartisan support for the war in Ukraine. And you've seen this play out in not only the funding that's been provided to help Ukraine, but you've also, and Jordy, as you said it well, I mean, the manifestation of all of this is the international community coming together in the UN to call out Russia. Somebody who's been around this place a lot longer than I have has said, CNN has probably broken into live coverage of the UN Security Council more over the past 6 months than it has probably since the run up to the war in Iraq. And so hopefully that gives people a better sense about why it matters, and as well as, the World Food Program is doing in terms of helping to feed people, or the Black Sea grain deal, or frankly, even, the human rights abuses in Xinjiang right now. I mean, it's important that a UN body has suggested that there may be crimes against humanity that have been committed by China. So all of this matters. But Jordy, as you said at the beginning, I mean, we've just finished an election where I think it's fair to say foreign policy of any kind, much less the role of the UN, just hasn't been a top issue for most Americans. That's not surprising, I think, given what we normally focus on elections. But it does suggest that there's an educational process that needs to happen.
Thank you. Let me go to another question from the audience. This one's from Boyd Haight. And Ambassador Liu, I think it's probably more in your lane, but it's concerning the UN regular budget. And he asked, or points out that for many years, US policy has been zero growth in the UN budget. I know no contribution, no increases in assessed contributions. This has led to an increased dependence of specialized agencies such as FAO and WHO on voluntary contributions. In May, the WHO Assembly agreed to look at long-term increases in assessed contributions to offset that. And so the question really is, what is the US position on the level of assessed contribution budgets going forward?
Yeah, I mean, look, I realize that has been the US position. I do think it's important to go back to my constant theme on this, it's important for us to explain why the UN matters. And I think it's important to push the UN to operate in a more accountable and transparent way. And I think if you can both show results and show that the money is being spent responsibly, that creates the impetus to grow the budgets. I mean, look, given the state of the world's problems, I would argue that it's unreasonable to suggest that all of these agencies should be flat funded. Now, that being said, I do think there's a broader conversation that needs to happen is, do we actually need all of these UN agencies across the board? I mean, there may be things that you want to plus up and some things you want to lower down. I think it is one of these issues that I think is being bandied about as we, look to the Summit of the Future and Secretaries, our common agenda. When you try to create a UN fit for purpose, does that mean that the UN should be involved in every global issue that there is? Or are there a set of issues that the UN can uniquely handle, whereas there's another set that really should be left to member states or private sector or philanthropy to address?
Jordy, would you like to?
Yeah,
Congresswoman Jacobs.
Yeah,
Please.
if I could add, and there's been a couple questions kind of along this front, and about kind of resources. There was a question about technology and peacekeeping. And I put an example, actually, mission that Ambassador Liu and Congresswoman Jacobs saw in South Sudan. We heard a little bit about this, but how actually they're putting in place solar panels so that the mission can be both cheaper and kind of not be have a lower reduced footprint in terms of oil and gas. That's a good example. A number of other UN agencies, UNHCR, I know a number of the refugee camps are using solar. That's one example. There's a question on helicopters and assets and how actually the UN has kind of lost a number of helicopters because Russia and Ukraine kind of provide them, and it gets to this resource question, which I think is important. Is sometimes there's a kind of a focus on, well, we should just do this because, but actually, resources and fully paying can make these missions stronger, can make them do the job, more quickly. Congresswoman Jacobs, to you, I mean, I saw you spoke at an event on women in peacekeeping, a few months back. You saw the mission there. One of the things we're all trying to do, the U.S. through legislation, the Women, Peace and Security Act, is trying to get more women peacekeepers. The mission there kind of talked about that they would need resources to retrofit missions. I mean, what are your thoughts on how, in that specific case, how to get kind of more women engaged, but how resources can be helpful in advancing interests that the U.S. supports?
Yeah, I think that it will be important for the United States to pay our full share of peacekeeping dues to make sure that we are demanding human rights are included in missions, to demand, meet the demands of women, peace, and security. And we know peacekeeping missions are strengthened by the presence of women. They improve peacekeeping performance. Often in many communities, they are able to get better access and, engage with women and bring a very different perspective to the conflict. We know peace processes that include women are more likely to be successful and long lasting. But right now, only about 5% of all military personnel, peacekeepers, are women. So we'd be able to be in a much stronger position, not only to push countries to increase the number of women serving, but to push missions to make the modifications to allow women to serve in these missions. On the technology piece, I actually worked in the innovation unit at UNICEF, and I think there's a lot of work being done on how we can better use technology to improve the work of the UN. While I was there, we were working on programs to allow young people to be able to tell us what's going on in their communities, called U-Report, that is now very successful, using technology to better be able to bring families back together after an emergency. When you have children often get separated from their families, be able to get test results more quickly. I started an organization called Project Connect that's working to connect schools around the world to the internet so that UNICEF can better provide educational programming to those schools. It's now been folded into a larger flagship project between UNICEF and ITU called GIGA that is working to do that as well. So there's a lot of work on how to use technology to improve the way these programs are working and these services are delivered. On the question of helicopters in particular, part of the problem, not the problem, one of the things is that the US military equipment tends to be much more high tech and involve a lot more training, and also have some proprietary technology that we don't necessarily want every country in the world to have access to. And so that has been the main hurdle in providing more military equipment.
And just a finer point on the helicopter question, because that's that's been a kind of evergreen problem, exactly as Congresswoman Jacobs said. And talking with the UN, the US technology is just, quite frankly, kind of too advanced. Now, that doesn't mean the US can't help, and one way can help is just kind of getting back to this importance of fully paying. I remember we had a conversation with folks at the Bangladeshi embassy, and they were saying they had a helicopter that they provided that was shot up, was unable to fly, and they weren't able to deploy a different one because they didn't have the resources to do it. And that's a country where, when we don't pay, what happens is troop contributing countries aren't fully reimbursed. So there are ways that we can help, and it's particularly important right now given the loss of helicopters due to the war in Ukraine.
Great. Well, thank you. We're coming to the end of our hour. I just wanted to invite our panelists, if you like, it's not a requirement, but if you'd like to make any kind of concluding comment based on the conversation we've had today. And then I'll turn it to Jordi to wrap things up.
I'll start and just simply thank you all for convening this important conversation. You know, far too often when we have discussions about the UN, they tend to be a little bit esoteric. This is actually a really concrete conversation that, you know, we're going to be facing, you know, an appropriations bill this year that can actually help address some of these issues. And obviously every year there's another appropriations bill that comes down the road. And so, you know, this is one that I think it's a small, relatively unknown issue about U.S. financing, but this one I think can have a critical impact on not only U.S. national security interests, but frankly in the overall functioning of the United Nations. And so just want to applaud Stimson for doing this, but really Congresswoman Jacobs for her leadership on this issue.
Well, yeah, I also want to thank Stimson and Andrew and Jordi, everything you all do at the Better World campaign. It is amazing having a partner like Ambassador Liu in the executive branch. It makes the case when I'm talking to my colleagues that we have someone who is working on reform, who's going to make sure the money is well spent, much easier to make. So I'm very grateful for all of your work, Ambassador Liu. And look, this is an important conversation that is going to have to continue. As Ambassador Liu said, we have an appropriations bill every year. We have to have this conversation around. I'm going to continue working on this in the new Congress and working with the new colleagues. And I think Ukraine will continue to show the importance of the UN and our investments. And I think as we continue down this path of competition, investments in the UN are only going to become more and more important. And so I'm very grateful we were able to have this conversation today.
Great. Thanks to both of you, our panelists. I really appreciate the sophistication and the concrete examples you brought to this. Jordi, any concluding remarks before we wrap up?
I just want to echo the gratitude. I mean, as someone who's had to kind of make the rounds on Capitol Hill for years, where this issue was deemed esoteric and just financing and kind of where we put a decimal point. I think today's conversation through the leadership is to show the central importance right now. I mean, our ability to mobilize coalitions at the UN against Russia, our ability to mobilize aid in places like Eastern Africa that desperately needed, or Yemen. Really, these things are central, and our presence, our engagement, our funding play a critical role. And so I'm just really appreciative to have the Stimson Center kind of hold this, and allies like Congresswoman Jacobs and Ambassador Liu helping make the case. It's of critical importance, and we greatly appreciate it.
Great. Thank you all very much. This project is ongoing at the Stimson Center. I urge you to keep tabs on the website. There'll be some research products coming out in the next few months. This conversation will be also available for those who couldn't make it today, so that you can review the comments and discussions we've had. And with that, thank you all very much for participating, and have a great day.